My name is Clara Jameson, and I never thought the words I typed into my family's group chat would change my life forever. I was trembling when I sent the message, "Miscarriage, needs support." Within seconds, the familiar notification ding confirmed it had gone through. But what followed wasn't comfort or concern. The chat went silent. No one replied. Not my mother, not my sister, not even my cousin Maya, who had always been the one I leaned on most. And when I thought the silence couldn't cut any deeper, I discovered that my cousin had screenshotted my message and shared it behind my back. That single action unleashed a chain of events that not only exposed painful family truths, but also forced me to reclaim my strength in ways I never thought possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The day had already been one of the darkest in my life. I had been barely able to breathe through the hollow ache in my chest as I left the doctor's office, clutching paperwork that confirmed what I already feared. I had lost the baby. At 8 weeks, the little heartbeat that had flickered so brightly at my last appointment was gone. I had never imagined how crushing silence could sound in an ultrasound room until that moment, when the technician's expression shifted and her eyes fell to the floor. The doctor's voice had been kind, professional, and steady, but every syllable blurred into a dull roar in my ears. All I could think was that the future I had imagined, tiny fingers curled around mine, laughter filling the halls of my small apartment, had evaporated into nothingness. When I got home that afternoon, the emptiness swallowed me whole. My boyfriend Daniel tried to hold me together with whispered reassurances, but even his arms couldn't stop the shattering inside me. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, desperate for the kind of family support I thought I could rely on. That was when I typed the words, short and blunt because I had no energy for explanation, "Miscarriage, needs support." It was my way of saying, I can't do this alone. Please don't make me carry this grief in silence. But silence was exactly what followed. At first, I told myself, maybe everyone was busy. My mom could be in her garden, my sister out running errands, my cousin Maya at work. I kept checking the phone every few minutes, staring at the little "seen by" under the message. One by one, the check marks appeared as each family member read my words. And still, no one responded. The quiet stretched on, turning minutes into an hour, and that hour into a sinking realization my pain was being met with avoidance. The strangest thing was that Maya had always been the one I thought would rush to my side. We grew up together, almost like sisters. She knew about my fears, my dreams of being a mother, and even the doubts I had whispered late at night about whether I would be strong enough for parenthood. Her silence felt like a betrayal. But I didn't know just how deep that betrayal would cut until 2 days later, when a mutual friend accidentally let slip that Maya had screenshotted my message and shared it with others outside the family chat. My private grief, the most vulnerable words I had ever written, had been turned into a piece of gossip. In those first moments of discovery, I felt stripped bare. Humiliation crawled across my skin as I imagined people whispering about my loss, people who weren't supposed to know. People who hadn't earned the right to hold my story. My miscarriage was not just my tragedy. It had been packaged into something consumable, something for others to dissect. That was when I realized my family's silence hadn't been an accident or a matter of timing. It was the beginning of a much bigger truth I had been avoiding. The people I expected to be my support system weren't as safe as I thought. Looking back, the signs had always been there. My family had a way of keeping emotions locked behind tight smiles and polite distance. Vulnerability wasn't welcomed. It was judged, criticized, or quietly ignored. I had spent years pretending that the silence was normal, that the occasional sharp remark or dismissive shrug was just the way we functioned. But now, in the middle of my deepest heartbreak, their silence became a weapon. And Maya's screenshot? That was the spark that revealed just how toxic the patterns had become. As I lay awake that night, replaying everything in my mind, I understood that this wasn't just about the miscarriage. It was about being seen, about being valued enough for someone to step in and say, "You're not alone." Instead, I was left in a void where silence screamed louder than words. The realization stung, but it also began to ignite something else in me. A slow, flickering anger that maybe, just maybe, would become the strength I needed to face what came next. I didn't yet know how far this betrayal would ripple through my life, or how the truth would eventually come to light in ways none of us expected. What I did know was that the story I thought I was living, the story of loss, was about to transform into something much larger. My cousin's screenshot wasn't just a careless act. It was the beginning of a revelation that would expose the fragile cracks in my family's foundation and force all of us to reckon with what loyalty, support, and love really meant. The morning after I sent that message to the family chat, I woke to the same silence. My phone screen glowed on the nightstand, still barren of any response, not even a single heart reaction or a short text of sympathy. The sting of their quiet felt sharper in daylight, less like forgetfulness and more like deliberate avoidance. Daniel made me a cup of tea and sat beside me, his hand resting gently on mine. But he didn't push me to talk. He knew me well enough to sense that the silence from my family was cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. As I sipped the lukewarm tea, I tried to convince myself that this was just how things worked in my family, that their distance and unwillingness to address hard truths had always been there. It wasn't the first time I had reached out with something painful, only to be met with evasion. Growing up in the Jameson household meant learning to bury emotions. My father, a stern man who believed in toughening up, often told us that crying was weakness, and my mother followed his lead with her own brand of detachment. She filled silences with chores, tasks, and small talk, but never with comfort. I learned early on that sadness was something to be swallowed, grief something to be tucked away in private. My sister, Eleanor, perfected the art of smiling through everything, wearing a mask of composure so flawless it was sometimes easy to believe she never struggled at all. And then there was Maya, my cousin, who lived just 2 streets away and spent most of her childhood in our house. She was the closest thing I had to an ally back then, but even she absorbed the family's pattern of sidestepping vulnerability when it became too heavy. Still, I had believed, maybe naively, that adulthood would change that once we were older, the weight of life would force us into more honest connections, that grief or struggle would make us reach for one another instead of pulling back. But here I was, with the most devastating loss of my life, and the family group chat, a digital thread meant to keep us connected, was now a monument to their avoidance. The very place where recipes and photos of nieces and nephews and cheerful holiday plans once filled my phone had become the stage for my humiliation. The irony gnawed at me. I had always been the one in the family who reached out, who made the effort to organize gatherings, to check in, to smooth over conflicts. I remembered birthdays, sent cards, called when someone was sick. I was the glue, or at least I tried to be. And yet, when I needed even a fraction of that energy returned, it seemed too much to ask. I stared at their little profile pictures in the chat, each face smiling back at me in a way that felt cruelly detached from the silence attached to them. By midday, my frustration bubbled into something restless. I scrolled through old messages in the chat as if searching for proof that I wasn't imagining this distance. The messages were all there. Maya asking for babysitting favors, Eleanor sharing vacation photos, my mom reminding us of an upcoming family barbecue. I saw my replies, my enthusiastic responses, my attempts to keep everyone stitched together. The imbalance had always been there, I realized, but I had ignored it because part of me needed to believe that my family was a safety net, however flawed. The truth, which the silence had now forced me to face, was that there was no net at all. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Daniel noticed the shift in my expression. He asked gently if I wanted him to reach out to them, to nudge them into acknowledging what had happened.
But the idea embarrassed me even more. I didn't want pity prodded out of them by someone else. I wanted them to care enough on their own. That was when the weight of the miscarriage tangled itself with an older grief, one I had buried for years. The grief of growing up in a family where my needs never quite seemed to matter. Losing the baby ripped that wound wide open, exposing the hidden problem that had always been there. The toxic silence of a family too proud, too cold, or too fearful to speak truth when it mattered most. Later that evening, I tried calling my mother directly. It rang twice before she picked up. Her voice was calm, almost distracted, as if she were folding laundry while we spoke. I told her I had lost the baby, that I was hurting, that I needed her. There was a pause, long enough to make my chest tighten, before she said, "I'm sorry to hear that, Clara. These things happen. You're strong. You'll get through it." Her tone was final, clipped, a dismissal disguised as encouragement. It wasn't cruelty in her words, but the lack of warmth behind them made it feel like I was confessing to a stranger. After I hung up, I sat there, numb, realizing that what I had always hoped for, that one day my mother would step into the role of nurturer, was never going to happen. Eleanor never called, Maya never messaged. The silence stretched into days, and each day solidified the truth. I was on my own in this grief, at least when it came to them.
But what I didn't yet understand was that this silence wasn't just passive neglect. Maya's screenshot, the one I hadn't seen but would soon learn about, was proof that my pain had been actively reshaped into something else, something I couldn't control. It was one thing to be ignored. It was another to be exposed. My most vulnerable moment reduced to a digital image, stripped of dignity and shared in whispers. That hidden problem, the toxic silence of my family, was about to collide with the hidden betrayal of my cousin. And together, they would unravel truths I had spent my whole life avoiding. 3 days after I sent that message to the family chat, the silence had become unbearable, like a weight pressing down on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I hadn't left the apartment except to shuffle to the mailbox or sit on the balcony for a few minutes of pale sunlight. My body still ached from the miscarriage, but it was the emptiness in my heart that cut deepest. I thought I had reached the limit of my pain until the breaking point came in a way I didn't expect. It arrived through a phone call from an acquaintance I barely spoke to anymore, a woman named Jenna, who had once been a part of our neighborhood circle. Her voice was tentative, hesitant in that way people get when they aren't sure if they're crossing a line. She said she was sorry for my loss. For a moment, I froze, my mind racing, because I hadn't told Jenna, and she wasn't in the family chat. She shouldn't have known. That was when the realization hit me with a force that made my stomach drop. My cousin Maya had shared my message, the one I had written in desperation, the one meant only for the people I trusted most. Somehow, Jenna had seen it, and if Jenna knew, then who else did? My grief, my private heartbreak, had been passed along like a secret too juicy to keep, reshaped into something to whisper about over coffee or text about late at night. The betrayal sliced through me sharper than the loss itself. At least the miscarriage was an act of nature, something cruel but beyond anyone's control. This, however, was a choice, a conscious decision made by someone I had loved like a sister. I sat on the couch, clutching the phone as tears blurred my vision. Daniel came into the room alarmed by the way my shoulders shook, and when I managed to tell him what happened, his jaw clenched. He wanted to call Maya immediately to demand an explanation, but I shook my head. I couldn't face her yet. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing one more push would send me plummeting. The old way of coping, the way I had always handled family conflict by swallowing my feelings, staying quiet, and pretending it didn't matter,
was no longer working. This wasn't something I could smooth over with politeness or let fade into the background. The wound was too raw, the betrayal too big. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The silence in the chat, my mother's clipped voice, Eleanor's absence, and now Maya's screenshot, a deliberate act that stripped me of privacy when I was already stripped of everything else. It was unsustainable. I could no longer pretend that my family's behavior was normal or that their avoidance was just a quirk I had to tolerate. I was beginning to see the truth. Their silence wasn't neutrality. It was complicity. And Maya's screenshot was proof that they didn't just avoid my pain, they exploited it. The next morning, the breaking point crystallized in a small, ordinary moment. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when my phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from a former coworker I hadn't spoken to in years, offering condolences. My stomach twisted as I typed a polite thank you, but inside I was shaking. If the news had reached her, then it was spreading further than I could imagine. My miscarriage had become a story told in circles I hadn't invited, a headline attached to my name without my consent. That was the moment I realized I couldn't go back to silence. I couldn't keep hiding, hoping my family would come around. The old way wasn't working, and if I didn't confront it, I would drown under the weight of both my grief and their betrayal. Daniel sat me down later that day, his eyes full of concern. He told me that grief had a way of breaking people, but it also had the power to reveal truths we had long avoided. He asked me the question I had been too afraid to face. Do you really want these people in your life if this is how they treat you? At first, the question felt too heavy, too final. They were my family, the people who had raised me, who had been in every photo album, every holiday, every milestone. Cutting them out felt impossible. But then I thought of the silence, of my screenshot, of my mother's detached words, and for the first time, I began to wonder if letting go was the only way to survive.
Later, as I scrolled through the family chat one more time, the quiet mocking me from the screen, I made a decision. I typed out a message, my hands trembling as the words appeared. I know some of you have shared my private message outside this group. This was deeply personal, and I trusted you. I can't describe the pain of losing my child, but having that loss turned into gossip is something I won't forgive easily. I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the send button. My heart pounded, my throat tightened, but I knew this was the point of no return. Sending it would shatter the illusion of harmony I had clung to for years. It would force the truth into the open where no one could pretend anymore. I pressed send. For a long while, nothing happened. The screen showed the familiar seen by notes again, one by one, as each family member read the message. My pulse thudded in my ears as I waited. Would they respond? Would they deny it? Would they finally break the silence? The minutes ticked by, stretching into a silence so thick it was suffocating. But I wasn't the same person I had been 3 days ago. I wasn't waiting for their validation anymore. This time, the silence wasn't going to bury me. It was going to push me to demand the truth. What I didn't realize in that moment was that my decision to send that message was the beginning of an unraveling that would pull the whole family into the light. The breaking point had arrived, and there was no going back. After I sent that message to the family chat, I felt like I had opened a door that could never be closed again. For years, I had kept that door sealed, locking away my resentment, ignoring the cracks in our family dynamic, and telling myself that love meant loyalty no matter how it was given. But as the message hung there on the screen, unread by some, read and ignored by others, I felt the sharp air of truth rush in. There was no hiding anymore. My words had been sent, my accusation made, and I had drawn a line in the sand, even if no one wanted to acknowledge it. The hours after sending it were agonizing, filled with the sound of my phone buzzing with unrelated notifications, work emails, spam texts, social media alerts, but none from the family chat.
Each silence stretched the wound deeper, but something had shifted in me. This time, instead of drowning in that silence, I began to study it, to let it tell me a story about who these people really were. The first crack came from an unexpected place. That evening, I got a private message from my Aunt Leela, my mother's younger sister. She wasn't active in the family chat most of the time, preferring one-on-one conversations, so I hadn't thought much of her absence. But her message was hesitant, almost cautious, as if she were tiptoeing into dangerous territory. She wrote, "Clara, I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for what you're going through. I don't know if it's my place, but I think you should know that I heard about your loss before I even saw your message in the group. Someone told me outside of the family." Her words confirmed what I already suspected, but hearing them spelled out like that hit me like a stone in the chest. It wasn't just Maya. The screenshot had spread further than I realized, and now even relatives who weren't part of the immediate circle were hearing about it secondhand. Aunt Leela's tone suggested she knew more, maybe even who had shared it, but she didn't say. I stared at her message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, trying to decide if I should press her for details. My stomach churned with the realization that my private grief was now a topic of conversation in households I hadn't even visited in months. It didn't take long for the ripples to reach beyond family. 2 days later, my friend Sarah, someone I trusted like a sister, called me out of the blue. She said she had seen a post online, vague but pointed, about someone in our town going through a miscarriage and how families aren't always what they seem. The post hadn't mentioned me by name, but Sarah knew enough to connect the dots. My chest went cold as I realized Maya's betrayal had spilled into the public, that the screenshot had left the walls of our group chat and now existed in the wider world as fodder for speculation. Daniel, watching me crumble under each new revelation, grew angrier by the day. He urged me to confront Maya directly, to demand accountability instead of letting her hide behind silence. But I was torn. Part of me still clung to the hope that she would come forward on her own, that she would apologize, that the cousin who had once been my closest confidant would reappear. Yet with each passing day, her silence deepened the wound. It wasn't just avoidance anymore. It was evidence of guilt. The more I thought about it, the more I saw how fragile the cover-up really was. The family strategy had always been silence. Ignore the problem and it will dissolve into the background. But this wasn't dissolving. The screenshot was circulating, reaching people who had no business knowing my story, and their whispers were amplifying the betrayal. The silence of the chat wasn't protecting them anymore. It was exposing them. Every unanswered message, every unread notification, every absence of comfort only sharpened the suspicion that they weren't silent out of helplessness, but out of fear of being caught.
I finally broke when Sarah insisted on meeting me for coffee. She had always been protective, sometimes fiercely so, and I could hear the fire in her voice when she said, "Clara, this isn't right. You can't let them do this to you." Sitting across from her at the small cafe we used to frequent after work, I poured out the entire story. The miscarriage, the message, the silence, the betrayal of the screenshot. For the first time, I said it all aloud, my voice shaking but clear. Sarah listened, her hands clenched around her mug, her eyes blazing with anger on my behalf. She told me something I hadn't let myself believe. "This isn't your shame. This is theirs." Her words stuck with me, echoing louder than the silence of my family. For so long, I had internalized their coldness, telling myself that maybe I was too sensitive, that maybe expecting support was asking too much. But now, with outside eyes on the situation, I saw it differently. It wasn't me who had failed. It was them. It wasn't me who had betrayed trust. It was Maya. The truth was beginning to unravel, not because they admitted it, but because their silence was being pierced by witnesses beyond their control. That night, back at home, I stared at the family chat again. I imagined each of them holding their phones, reading my words, choosing to say nothing, hoping the storm would pass. But the storm wasn't passing. It was gathering force. The cracks were spreading, and soon there would be no place left for them to hide. For the first time, I felt a flicker of power, a sense that I wasn't just a victim of their silence. The truth was working its way out, whether they liked it or not. What I didn't know yet was how messy that truth would become, or how much resistance I would face when I finally demanded they look me in the eye.
The outside world had begun to see the truth, and once that door was opened, there was no way to close it again. The point of no return had been crossed. The days that followed were a blur of restless energy, like a wound that refused to close. Every time my phone buzzed, I flinched, wondering if it would be another reminder that my loss had been shared outside the boundaries of trust. I wanted so badly to turn away from it, to let time dull the sting, but my mind wouldn't stop circling back. Each unanswered message in the family chat, each vague apology from distant acquaintances, each whispered condolence from people I hadn't confided in, all of it added up to something I could no longer ignore. I needed to know exactly who had betrayed me and how far the betrayal had traveled. It began quietly, almost like detective work done in the shadows of grief. I messaged Aunt Leela again, more direct this time, asking her who had told her about my miscarriage before my group message. She hesitated at first, but eventually admitted that she'd heard it from a neighbor who claimed it was Maya who shared the news. She said she didn't want to tell me because she didn't want to make family tensions worse. Hearing her finally confirm what I already suspected made my chest tighten, but it also fueled a determination I hadn't felt before. It was Maya. It had always been Maya. I decided to dig further, quietly and methodically. I called Jenna, the acquaintance who had first tipped me off, and asked her how she knew. She was reluctant to say at first, but eventually confessed that Maya had texted her directly, sending the screenshot along with a casual comment, "Clara's not doing well, just thought you should know." The words burned into me. Not only had she shared the screenshot, but she had attached her own narrative to it, framing my private heartbreak as if it were gossip to be delivered. Jenna sounded guilty as she told me this, apologizing for being part of the chain, but the damage was already done. Piece by piece, the evidence gathered itself. Sarah, my friend, helped me track down the vague social media posts that had spread the whispers even further. It wasn't under Maya's account, but the phrasing was similar to something Maya had once said to me in private. It didn't take much to connect the dots. Maya had sparked the fire, and others had fanned it. My grief had become a story circulating beyond my control, passed from person to person like some cruel game of telephone. The more I uncovered, the more the tension in the family grew. Though no one directly responded in the chat, I noticed a shift in tone when I called my mother again. She seemed defensive, her words sharp around the edges. "Clara, why are you making such a big deal of this? People talk. It's not the end of the world. Dwelling on it won't help you heal." Her dismissal wasn't new, but this time it felt heavier, more deliberate, as if she were trying to shut me down before I gathered too much truth. It dawned on me that protecting Maya, or protecting the family's image, might mean more to her than protecting me. Even Daniel noticed the opposition beginning to mount. He pointed out how Eleanor, my sister, hadn't said a single word to me since the miscarriage. She had read every message, but never typed a response, not even a single emoji. When I called her, she made excuses about being busy with her kids, her voice strained but careful, as though she were tiptoeing around landmines. The silence wasn't passive, it was strategic. The more I pushed for answers, the more they closed ranks, avoiding direct confrontation, but refusing to acknowledge the betrayal.
That was when I realized the depth of the family's coping mechanism. For years, they had survived by keeping everything buried. Anger, grief, shame, anything that threatened the fragile image of harmony. By exposing Maya's betrayal, I was threatening the system itself. They weren't just avoiding me, they were defending themselves, defending the silence that kept everything neatly in place. And in doing so, they were telling me, without words, that I was the problem for speaking out. But the evidence wouldn't let me retreat back into silence. Every time I pieced together another confirmation of Maya's actions, I felt the weight of betrayal settle deeper in my chest. But I also felt my resolve harden. I began writing everything down: names, dates, conversations, who said what. It wasn't about revenge, not at first. It was about clarity, about finally seeing the pattern that had ruled my life for so long. The pattern of being silenced, of being told my feelings were too much, of being dismissed or ignored when I needed someone to listen. This time, I wouldn't let the truth slip through the cracks. One night, Daniel found me sitting at the dining table with scraps of paper scattered around me, each one holding a note or quote from the last week. He put his hand on my shoulder and asked what I was doing. I told him I was gathering the truth because if I didn't hold on to it, they would try to erase it. He nodded, his expression fierce with solidarity. Then let's make sure it can't be erased. As I continued gathering evidence, I began to feel the walls closing in. I could sense the unease in the family, even without their words. My mother's clipped tone, Eleanor's silence, the faint traces of conversations happening behind my back, they were all signals that they knew I was pulling at the threads. And though no one admitted it, I could feel their defense building like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It wasn't just about a screenshot anymore. It was about the unspoken rules of our family. Rules I was breaking simply by insisting that my pain deserved acknowledgement. I was demanding a truth they didn't want to face, and in their eyes, that made me dangerous. The opposition was rising, subtle but unmistakable, and as much as it hurt, part of me welcomed it. Because the more they resisted, the clearer it became. I was on the right path. What I didn't realize yet was that the more evidence I gathered, the closer I was coming to a revelation that would shatter the last of my illusions. The undeniable proof was waiting, just beyond my reach. And when it surfaced, there would be no silence strong enough to bury it again. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon, though at first, it felt like any other weary day spent juggling grief and a restless search for answers. I had just finished folding laundry when my phone buzzed with a new message, and instinctively my heart clenched, wondering who it might be this time. When I opened it, my hands began to tremble. It was a forwarded screenshot, the kind that had haunted my nightmares since the betrayal began. Only this time, there was no question of who had done it. The image showed my original family group chat message, the one where I had typed, "Miscarriage needs support," but unlike before, the screenshot carried visible traces of Maya's digital fingerprints. At the top corner of the image was her name, clear as day, showing that she had been the one to capture it. Worse still, the message she had written beneath it was included, words that sliced through me with their cold detachment. "Just thought people should know, since she's making it so dramatic." There it was, the undeniable proof stripped of excuses or speculation. My cousin had not only betrayed my trust, she had framed my plea for help as melodrama, a spectacle to be shared and judged rather than a moment of raw honesty. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as my chest tightened and my breathing grew shallow. I felt as though the ground had opened beneath me, exposing not only the betrayal but the cruelty behind it. This was no misunderstanding, no accidental slip of information. This was deliberate. The screenshot had been sent to me by Jenna, the same acquaintance who had first warned me weeks earlier. She apologized profusely in the message, explaining that she thought I deserved to know the full truth. She said the screenshot had made its way through a group of people connected to Maya's social circle, and by the time it reached her, the tone of conversation was already mocking, dismissive. "I'm sorry, Clara," she wrote. "I didn't know how to tell you before, but it felt wrong for you not to see it with your own eyes." Her honesty hurt, but it also pierced through the fog of doubt that had been swirling inside me. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. Maya had taken my grief and turned it into something to sneer at when I was at my most vulnerable.
I spent that night sleepless, the glow of the phone screen illuminating the darkness as I stared at the image again and again. Every time I looked at it, I found new layers of cruelty. The fact that she had typed so dramatic beneath the screenshot, reducing my plea for support to some performance, revealed not just betrayal, but contempt. And worse, the silence from the rest of the family loomed heavier now. They had seen this proof long before I did. They had known. And still, they had chosen not to confront her, not to defend me, not even to acknowledge my pain. Their quiet was no longer ambiguous. It was complicity. The next day, I decided I could no longer sit with the truth in silence. I I reopened the family chat, the same one where my plea had been met with emptiness, and I dropped the screenshot into the conversation without a single word. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the familiar gray check marks showing the message had been read. Then, slowly, the responses trickled in. My mother was first. Her reply clipped, "Clara, why would you send this? You're only making things worse." Eleanor followed with a vague attempt at smoothing things over. "I think we all need to take a breath. This isn't helping anyone." But not one person acknowledged what the screenshot actually showed. Not one of them condemned Maya's actions. Their priority was to contain, to dismiss, to keep the silence intact. When Maya finally responded, it was with the kind of brazenness that made my blood run cold. "Wow, Clara, are you seriously stalking my messages now? You're obsessed. Everyone talks, get over it." She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She attacked me as though I were the one in the wrong for exposing what she had done. Her words dripped with mockery, reinforcing the same contempt she had shown in her private messages. It was a performance for the rest of the family, one she knew they would quietly support by refusing to take sides. Daniel urged me to step away from the chat, but I couldn't. My hands shook as I typed back, the anger in me no longer containable. "This isn't about gossip. This is about you betraying me when I ask for help. You took my pain and made it into entertainment, and the rest of you let it happen." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, the words glowing on the screen like a flare shot into the night. The silence that followed was suffocating, but it didn't frighten me anymore. If anything, it clarified what I had always known deep down. They would never protect me, not from Maya, not from the patterns that had always defined our family. Their silence was their answer, their choice. And for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. Proof had freed me from the endless cycle of doubt and self-blame. They had shown me who they truly were, and no amount of gaslighting could erase the screenshot in my hand. Yet even with this clarity, I knew the road ahead would not be simple. The undeniable proof had cracked the facade, but the family's defenses were strong, and the battle lines had now been drawn. I could sense that Maya would not stop here, that she would try to twist the narrative further, casting me as unstable, dramatic, untrustworthy. The silence of the others gave her room to maneuver, to turn the truth into yet another story she controlled. But now, armed with undeniable evidence, I no longer feared the lies as much as I feared my own silence. The proof was out in the open, and though it hurt like nothing I'd ever known, it also lit the path forward. The day after I dropped the screenshot into the family chat, the tension in the air felt almost tangible, even over text. I could feel the storm brewing through the little indicators on my phone, the typing dots that lingered too long, the read receipts that appeared and disappeared with agonizing slowness. It was as if the silence itself was testing me, waiting to see whether I would fold under the weight of the betrayal or finally take a stand. I couldn't fold. Not anymore. The miscarriage had left a hollow ache in my chest, but it was the betrayal, the exposure, and the deafening silence that had ignited a fire I couldn't ignore. If I didn't speak, if I didn't finally demand accountability, the truth of my pain would continue to be dismissed and reshaped into gossip, and I couldn't survive that twice over. Maya's response was the first crack in the dam. She didn't approach it with shame or guilt. Instead, she attacked with precision. "Clara, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Everyone in the family has feelings, not just you. Stop overreacting." Her words were calculated, as if she had rehearsed them in advance, knowing they would provoke me while providing plausible deniability to anyone else reading. And the family, predictably, didn't intervene. My mother echoed Maya's sentiment with her familiar coldness. "We don't need to air family matters like this. You're being dramatic, Clara, and it isn't helping." Eleanor remained quiet, which in its own way was worse than saying anything at all. Her silence made me realize that they had drawn the line, choosing Maya's comfort and the family image over my grief. Their loyalty was not to me, it was to the fragile shell of normalcy they had always clung to.
I felt an overwhelming surge of anger, grief, and exhaustion all at once. For years, I had tiptoed around their sensitivities, moderated my words, swallowed my pain, and adjusted my expectations to fit their capacity for empathy. Now, with undeniable proof in hand, I was forced to recognize that those compromises had never been enough. My voice, my pain, my humanity had been reduced to a punchline for Maya's amusement, and the rest of the family had silently condoned it. The familiar pattern of self-blame and doubt tried to creep back in, whispering that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I should let it go. But this time, the voice was drowned out by a louder, harder truth. Staying quiet would only give them the power to continue controlling the narrative. I made the choice that afternoon to confront them head-on. It wasn't easy. My hands shook as I typed, each word a small act of defiance. I didn't just accuse Maya anymore. I addressed the family collectively, naming their silence as what it was: complicity. I trusted you all, I wrote. I reached out when I was hurting, hoping for support, and instead my grief was shared without my consent, mocked, and dismissed. Your silence doesn't protect me, it protects her. And it protects the image of a family that only pretends to care. Hitting send felt like stepping off a cliff. Once the message was out, there was no turning back. The responses, when they came, were immediate and incendiary. Maya doubled down, trying to twist the narrative further. "Clara, you're obsessed. You're making this about you again. Everyone's tired of the drama." It was classic gaslighting, turning the victim into the aggressor, a tactic I had seen in the past, but never in such a personal, brutal form. My mother's reply was similarly protective of Maya, dismissive yet tinged with authority. "Enough, Clara. Stop attacking your cousin. Family disagreements happen, and this isn't the place to argue. You're making things worse for everyone." Eleanor's continued silence, paired with her subtle likes on Maya's defensive comments, drove the point home. The rest of the family had chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. At that moment, the familiar ache of isolation hit me full force. The miscarriage had left me physically weak, emotionally raw, and now psychologically cornered by the people I had once counted on the most. I could feel panic rising, a pressing sense of all being lost, and for a heartbeat, I questioned myself. Had I made a mistake by confronting them? Was the cost of speaking the truth higher than staying silent? But even as the doubt clawed at me, I knew the alternative: remaining quiet, allowing my pain to be minimized, allowing the betrayal to go unchallenged was far worse. Silence had always been their weapon. Speaking was my only choice. By evening, the battle lines had solidified. Conversations that should have been supportive had become arenas of conflict. My mother and Eleanor were defensive, maneuvering to maintain appearances to prevent the family from fracturing in public view. Maya remained aggressive, attempting to dominate the narrative, to convince anyone reading that I was the problem, the dramatizer, the obsessive one. But every time I reread the screenshot, every time I remembered the words she had written beneath it, I felt a renewed clarity. I was no longer the one who needed to be hidden, minimized, or dismissed. I was the one with the truth. And for the first time, the truth belonged solely to me. That night, Daniel sat beside me, holding my hand as I scrolled through the endless notifications. He said, "This isn't just about a message anymore. This is about showing them that your grief matters, that your truth can't be silenced. They can try to spin it, they can try to gaslight you, but you've already taken the first step." His words grounded me, reminded me why I had made this choice, why speaking was no longer optional. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about justice, accountability, and reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped from me. I went to bed that night with a mixture of dread and resolve. I knew that when I woke, the family would still be entrenched, Maya's defenses as strong as ever, my mother's coldness unchanged, Eleanor's silence a continued betrayal. But I also knew that the line had been drawn. The choice to speak had been made, and there was no returning to the old passive version of myself. For the first time in my life, my grief had been externalized, exposed, and demanded acknowledgement. And as terrifying as the fallout might be, it was now inevitable that the truth would have its day. The next week felt like stepping into a pressure cooker, every interaction with my family layered with tension so thick I could almost taste it.
The family chat, once a quiet, passive place, had become a battleground, every message scrutinized, every pause in response charged with meaning. Maya was relentless, her attacks escalating from dismissive remarks to targeted jabs that aimed to undermine me publicly. She had taken her original betrayal and turned it into a performance, a spectacle designed to paint me as overreactive and unstable, and she did it with a confidence that left me reeling. I knew then that I was dealing with an antagonist who not only refused to acknowledge her wrongdoing, but actively sought to twist reality in her favor.
It started with passive-aggressive comments, the kind that could be easily brushed off, but their frequency and precision left little room for doubt. "Maybe some people just need attention," Maya wrote after my most recent message about feeling unsupported. My mother followed with her own chilling response. "We all need to move on. This obsession with the past is unhealthy, Clara." The words weren't just dismissive, they were a subtle attempt to invalidate my grief and my experience. They were trying to isolate me, to make me feel as though the moral high ground I had taken by speaking the truth was a personal flaw instead. Every unread emoji, every delayed response, every careful phrasing was another layer of pressure designed to weigh me down and make me doubt myself. But the confrontation didn't stay behind screens for long. My cousin Sarah, who had been quietly supporting me outside the family, encouraged me to organize a video call so the truth could be addressed directly. At first, I hesitated, knowing it would mean facing Maya and the rest of the family head-on. I had been mentally bracing for months, but speaking to them all at once, with the undeniable proof of their betrayal in front of me, was a different kind of storm. Daniel sat beside me as I prepared, his hand resting on mine as a silent anchor. He reminded me that no matter how aggressive Maya became, the truth was already on my side. When the call began, the tension was instantaneous, a tight coil of emotion that I could feel pressing against my ribs. Maya's face appeared first, smug, expectant, as though she already anticipated winning. My mother's expression was flat, defensive, the kind that always indicated she was calculating her words to protect someone else while appearing neutral. Eleanor avoided my gaze entirely. Her lips pressed into a thin line, betraying the quiet discomfort that came with watching a betrayal unfold without taking a side. The conversation started with small talk, a pretense to lower the temperature, but it quickly escalated when I held up my phone and shared the screenshot once again. For a moment, silence filled the screen. Maya's face flickered with something like irritation, then hardened into defensiveness. "Clara, you're obsessed with this. You're trying to make me the villain," she said, her voice tight. "Everyone knows you overreact, and now you're making this into a public accusation?" I stayed calm, though my heart hammered in my chest. "This isn't public," I said. "This is private, between family members. You took my words meant for the people I trusted and shared them as a joke. You ridiculed my grief. That's the truth, Maya. And I have proof." The screenshot glowed between us like a spotlight illuminating every lie she had tried to hide. The mounting pressure wasn't just emotional, it became physical. My hands trembled as I spoke, my throat tight, but I refused to let her gaslighting dominate the space. Maya tried every tactic she had perfected over the years: denial, diversion, mockery, but I countered each with facts, dates, and the unshakable evidence before us. My mother attempted to intervene, using her authority to redirect the conversation, to try to calm the rising tension, but I cut through it gently but firmly. This isn't about calming anyone down. It's about accountability. If you can't acknowledge what happened, then we're just repeating the same cycle over and over. It was exhausting, emotionally and mentally. I could see the cracks in my own composure reflected in the webcam, the slight quiver of my lip, the tense curl of my shoulders, but I refused to stop. The confrontation had to happen. The truth had to confront the deception head on. Maya's mask began to slip, Her eyes darted, her tone faltered, and her usual confident smile disappeared in places, replaced by a strain that betrayed discomfort she could not disguise. The evidence I had gathered, the concrete proof of her betrayal, was cornering her, forcing her to reckon with something she had long ignored. Her actions were indefensible. For the first time, my mother hesitated, her words faltering. The authority she always wielded like a shield seemed diminished as the truth hung in the air. Eleanor's posture stiffened, the silence no longer passive, it was now tension thick enough to choke on. Even as I felt exhausted and drained, a strange sense of empowerment began to rise within me. The mounting pressure wasn't just against me, it was revealing the weaknesses and the cracks in the family structure, exposing the truth that had been buried under years of avoidance and silent complicity. By the end of the call, I was exhausted, my voice hoarse, my hands shaking, but there was a shift. The confrontation had forced a reckoning. Maya no longer had the upper hand entirely. Her attempts to gaslight were visibly strained. The family's silence had fractured, replaced by hesitation and uncertainty. For the first time, I could see that the walls they had built to protect themselves were permeable, vulnerable to the undeniable truth I held in my hands. The pressure had mounted to a breaking point, and while the aftermath would not be simple, the confrontation had ensured that the truth could no longer be quietly dismissed. I closed my laptop, my body sagging with exhaustion, and leaned back. Daniel held me tightly, whispering that I had done the right thing. I had faced the antagonist, confronted the family, and forced the truth into the open. Though the storm was far from over, I finally understood something vital. When the truth is undeniable, even the strongest walls can't hold it back forever.
After the confrontation with Maya and the family, I thought the worst was behind me, that at least some clarity had been achieved. But the following days proved that exposing the truth often comes with consequences far harsher than the betrayal itself. The moment I let the evidence speak, the backlash began in full force, like a wave I couldn't hold back. Every interaction I had with my family became tense, charged with anger, disappointment, or a thinly veiled contempt. The people I had once trusted to support me, to acknowledge my pain, were now silent or subtly hostile, and I began to feel the heavy weight of isolation pressing down on my chest. It was as though speaking the truth had made me a target instead of a survivor, and the emotional toll was suffocating. At work, I became distant, my thoughts consumed with the fallout from the family conflict. My mind replayed every word of the confrontation, every hesitation in their voices, every attempt at gaslighting I had endured. Friends reached out with concern, but I often brushed them off, retreating into myself. Even Daniel, who had stood unwaveringly by my side, could only do so much to ease the pressure. Some nights, I found myself staring at the ceiling, the room silent except for the occasional car passing outside, and wondering if speaking the truth had been a mistake. The isolation was profound, and the sense of betrayal so deep that I questioned not only my family's loyalty, but my own judgment in trusting them at all. The worst came in subtle, almost insidious forms. My mother, who had always wielded authority in the family, began to subtly punish me with neglect, the kind that feels like an emotional slap each time it occurs. She avoided my calls, dismissed my attempts at conversation, and carefully ignored the evidence I had presented, treating the confrontation as a phase I would eventually regret. Eleanor, still silent, made no effort to reach out or mediate, and their collective coldness was a constant reminder that speaking the truth often isolates the one who dares to do so. Maya, emboldened by their tacit approval, continued to belittle me in private messages to other relatives, turning small moments into opportunities to undermine my credibility. It was relentless, a storm that seemed unending.
and I felt myself starting to buckle under the pressure. Even outside the family, the effects were tangible. Some distant relatives who had been sympathetic initially withdrew once the family line had been drawn. Messages that once carried support turned into carefully worded observations, neutral at best, tinged with subtle judgment at worst. I realized painfully that revealing the truth was not just about exposing Maya, it was about challenging an entire system of silence, and systems don't relinquish control easily. The world, even the small circle I thought I could trust, seemed to view my grief and my stand as a disruption rather than a declaration of justice. The loneliness was unbearable, and at times I couldn't imagine a way out. There were nights I broke down completely, curled on the couch with Daniel holding me, his own eyes brimming with helplessness. The miscarriage alone had left scars, physical and emotional, but the social and familial fallout cut even deeper. I had been silenced for so long, conditioned to believe that my emotions were too much, too inconvenient. And now that I had spoken, the repercussions made me question whether anyone could truly stand with me. It was a test of endurance I hadn't anticipated, one where every day presented a new challenge of staying firm in the face of relentless opposition. I began to doubt whether my courage had been misplaced, whether the pursuit of justice was worth the continued pain. Yet, even in the depths of despair, there were small moments of clarity that kept me tethered to reality. Daniel reminded me that the backlash was a natural reaction from people who were unaccustomed to accountability. He told me that their silence, their judgment, their withdrawal, all of it was a reflection of their ability to confront their own complicity, not a measure of my worth or the validity of my grief. Slowly, I began to internalize that while the family's response was painful, it didn't erase the truth I had uncovered. It didn't diminish the courage it had taken to finally speak. The world, though harsh, could not rewrite the events that had occurred or the evidence I held in my hands. I also found solace in small gestures from unexpected corners. Jenna reached out again, offering encouragement and checking in to see how I was managing the emotional weight of the confrontation. Friends who had been distant returned with gentle words of affirmation, reminding me that while the family might fail to provide support, there were others who could stand with me. Daniel's unwavering presence, his quiet affirmations, and the way he never questioned my decision to speak the truth became an anchor in the storm. Slowly, I realized that isolation was temporary, and that my grief, though exploited by others, was still mine to process on my own terms. Still, the darkness lingered. There were nights I stared at the phone, wondering if the next message from Maya would undo the fragile stability I was trying to build. Every silence from my mother and Eleanor felt like a new wound. Every whispered conversation about me in the background of family gatherings reminded me that the fallout from speaking the truth was far from over. Yet beneath the despair, a quiet resilience began to grow. The truth had been spoken, undeniable and irrefutable, and though the consequences were harsh, they were evidence that I had finally broken free from the cycle of silence and complicity.
By the end of the week, I realized that my lowest point wasn't just about grief or betrayal. It was about confronting the reality of what it means to challenge entrenched systems, even those made up of people we love. The emotional toll was immense, but in that dark night of the soul, I began to sense the first glimmers of clarity. That the path forward, though difficult, was mine to choose, and that the courage to face opposition head-on was a step toward reclamation, toward vindication, toward eventual justice. The shadows were deep, but they no longer controlled me entirely. The day of the family meeting felt like stepping into a courtroom where the jury had already been biased, but the evidence was finally mine to present. After days of tension, whispered conversations, and emotionally charged texts, I had convinced my mother and siblings to sit down together in the living room with all parties present. Maya, predictably, arrived with a defensive air, ready to spin the narrative, her phone in hand, as if she had rehearsed every line. Daniel stayed by my side, offering silent support and the occasional grounding squeeze of my hand. I knew this was my moment, the culmination of weeks of emotional labor, painstaking evidence gathering, and standing firm despite isolation and opposition. The truth would finally be out, and I had to make sure it could not be dismissed. I began with a deep breath, steadying my voice as I addressed the room. I recounted the miscarriage, the pain I had endured, and the loneliness that followed in the wake of my announcement. I spoke honestly, vulnerably, refusing to let my voice be swallowed by the familiar patterns of deflection I had experienced for years. Then I held up the screenshot of my original family chat message, the one Maya had taken, and the messages beneath it that mocked my grief. "This is the moment when trust was broken," I said, making sure everyone in the room could see the evidence. The silence that followed was thick, nearly suffocating, as if the gravity of the betrayal had finally settled over them. Maya shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her usual smug composure faltering under the weight of the proof. "Clara, it's not like," she began, but I stopped her. "No, Maya," I said firmly. "It is exactly like that. You shared my grief, ridiculed it, and exposed it without consent. Your words here are clear, and your intent is undeniable." My mother, who had always been quick to shield Maya, flinched at the directness of my words. Even Eleanor, whose silence had been a form of passive complicity, now looked uncomfortable, the truth pressing into her inescapably. For the first time, the room held no room for ambiguity. The evidence was irrefutable. I continued, recounting the chain of events, the messages from Jenna confirming the forwarding of the screenshot, the subtle ways the family had chosen silence over support, the deliberate dismissal of my pain. Each fact was laid bare, carefully, methodically, leaving little room for spin or denial. I could feel Maya's defenses strain, her voice shaky now, as she tried to interject, but the foundation of truth I had built was solid. I refused to let her undermine the narrative, refusing to allow her habitual gaslighting to redirect the conversation. Every piece of evidence, every corroborating message, every quiet acknowledgement from outside sources I had gathered over weeks was now part of a single, undeniable narrative. As I spoke, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. My mother's attempts to protect Maya softened slightly, but not entirely. The conflict between family loyalty and accountability was palpable in every line of her face. Eleanor shifted in her seat, unable to maintain her previous silence in the face of such clarity. Maya, trapped by the undeniable proof, attempted to minimize her actions, but the screenshot remained a visual anchor that contradicted every word she said. It was the turning point. Her excuses could no longer hold up against the solid evidence of her betrayal. Daniel whispered encouragement in my ear, reminding me to stay grounded, but I felt a new strength rising inside me. The weeks of emotional labor, the sleepless nights spent tracking messages, the painstaking gathering of evidence, all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. I was no longer just confronting a cousin who had betrayed me. I was confronting a system of silence, a pattern of dismissal that had allowed abuse and ridicule to persist unchecked. And now, for the first time, the room could not escape the confrontation. The truth was on trial, and I was both the prosecutor and the witness, armed with irrefutable evidence. Maya's posture sagged, her confident mask shattered. She tried one last time to redirect blame, to make me seem irrational, but it no longer had the intended effect. The rest of the family, confronted with concrete proof they could not deny, began to shift.
My mother's voice wavered as she acknowledged the reality she had been avoiding. I see it now, she said, the admission carrying a weight of guilt and shame. Eleanor finally spoke, her words hesitant but sincere. I didn't act, and I should have. I see that now, too. The shift was subtle, but it was monumental. The balance had begun to tip, and accountability was no longer optional. The room's energy changed, the tension replaced by a somber reckoning. Maya, stripped of her defenses, sat in silence, confronted with the consequences of her actions and the undeniable evidence that no longer allowed her to dismiss or deflect. I felt a surge of relief and empowerment wash over me, not from triumph over her, but from the restoration of my own voice, my own agency. For the first time, I was heard, validated, and no longer silenced by those who had once held authority over my grief.
By the time the meeting ended, the truth had stood its ground. Maya remained uncomfortable, the family's acknowledgement of their complicity lingering in the air, but the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. I had faced the storm of opposition, the mounting pressure, and the personal cost, and emerged with clarity and validation. The final push, the culmination of weeks of confrontation and preparation, had ensured that the truth was not only seen, but recognized, and that my voice, once ignored, could no longer be silenced. The days following the confrontation were quieter, but not in the suffocating way the weeks of silence had been. The storm of words, accusations, and defensiveness had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt fragile yet promising. For the first time in months, I experienced a sense of cautious relief, as if the truth had finally settled into the world and no one could erase it. My mother, though still guarded, began to approach me differently. There was a tentative acknowledgement in her tone when she spoke, a subtle recognition of the hurt I had endured and the courage it had taken to speak. It wasn't a full reconciliation yet, but it was a step toward accountability. A willingness to confront what had been ignored for too long. Eleanor, too, showed signs of change. Her previous silence, which had contributed to the isolation and betrayal, softened into curiosity and tentative engagement. She asked questions, not probing or accusatory, but genuine attempts to understand my experience, to reconcile her own inaction with the reality of the harm that had been done. It was a small but significant shift, signaling that the truth had not only reached me, but had begun to ripple through others, breaking down old patterns and forcing acknowledgement. Even Maya, though she continued to avoid full admission, was quieter. The confidence she once wielded like a weapon diminished by the undeniable proof and the family's slow movement toward awareness. I found that the equilibrium didn't come from punishment or retaliation, but from the validation of my voice. Speaking the truth had released me from the long shadow of silence and complicity. I no longer needed to tiptoe around family sensitivities or hide my grief to maintain appearances. The miscarriage, the betrayal, and the subsequent confrontation had reshaped the family dynamic in subtle ways, establishing a new baseline where honesty could no longer be ignored and where attempts to manipulate or mock were met with clear recognition. I could speak without fear that my pain would be weaponized, and that alone was transformative. In the days that followed, I also noticed a shift in myself. The process of gathering evidence, confronting the antagonist, and standing firm through backlash had strengthened my resilience. I felt more grounded in my emotions, more confident in my ability to advocate for myself, and more willing to trust my instincts. Where once I would have second-guessed every move, hesitant to confront even minor slights, I now approached situations with measured clarity. The ordeal had been grueling, emotionally and mentally, but it had also revealed the depth of my own courage and the power of owning my truth. Outside the family sphere, the repercussions were more subtle but equally meaningful. Friends who had witnessed my journey expressed admiration, support, and renewed trust. I found that my experience resonated with others, encouraging conversations about boundaries, accountability, and the importance of speaking up in the face of betrayal.
What had once felt like an intensely private humiliation became a catalyst for broader awareness and connection. I realized that while I could not control the actions of others, I could use my experience to illuminate the consequences of silence, the importance of validation, and the strength that comes from confronting the uncomfortable truth. Daniel, steadfast as ever, played a pivotal role in my emotional recovery. His presence reminded me that support does not always have to come from the family of origin. Sometimes it comes from chosen family, those who stand by your side without judgment. He encouraged me to focus on rebuilding the bonds that were genuine, nurturing relationships that were rooted in trust rather than obligation. Slowly, we created our own rhythm, one in which the past was acknowledged but no longer a weapon to silence or manipulate us. It was a new equilibrium, a personal sanctuary within the ongoing complexity of familial relationships. A family, while not fully reconciled, began to show signs of adapting to the new reality. Conversations were more measured, the tension lessened, and moments of empathy began to surface, even if inconsistently. The hierarchy of power that had allowed betrayal and silence to flourish was subtly shifting. Accountability had become an unavoidable factor in every interaction. I recognized that the equilibrium was not static. It was fragile, requiring ongoing effort and clarity. But for the first time, it was a balance where truth could exist without being buried. As weeks turned into months, the lingering ache from the miscarriage remained, a quiet reminder of loss and resilience. But it no longer existed alongside isolation or betrayal. Speaking the truth had created space for genuine support, for healing that had previously felt impossible. I found myself reclaiming activities, friendships, and even family interactions that had been overshadowed by fear and doubt. The experience had taught me that while some relationships may never recover fully, others could evolve, shaped by honesty and acknowledgement of past mistakes.
In this new equilibrium, I also discovered a sense of purpose. I began to consider how my journey could help others navigating betrayal, grief, and silence. Through conversations, social sharing, and supportive dialogue, I found ways to transform pain into insight, using my story to empower others to confront dishonesty and claim their voice. The courage to speak, once a personal battle, became a tool to illuminate the path for others who might otherwise feel trapped in the shadows of manipulation and neglect. By the end of this period, the family dynamic had changed. Subtle, yet irrevocable. Maya's influence had been tempered, my mother's protective reflexes softened into reflection, and Eleanor's silence transformed into tentative engagement. The family, once a source of isolation and pain, was entering a new phase, one in which acknowledgement of truth and responsibility were no longer optional, but inevitable. I had achieved a resolution. Not perfect, not complete, but meaningful. I had reclaimed my voice, validated my grief, and reshaped the foundation of my relationships. The equilibrium was fragile, but real. A testament to the power of speaking truth in the face of opposition, and the strength that comes from insisting on recognition, even when it comes at great personal cost. Months had passed since the confrontation, and life felt remarkably different, though no less real. The grief of the miscarriage remained a quiet undercurrent in my daily life, but it no longer defined me or dictated the terms of my interactions. I had grown stronger, not in the sense of being untouched by loss or betrayal, but in a resilience born of surviving both and refusing to be silenced. Each day brought a reminder of the journey I had undertaken, the courage required to speak my truth, and the empowerment that comes from claiming one's voice even in the face of those who would seek to dismiss or diminish it. The scars of the past, both emotional and relational, had transformed into symbols of endurance and the hard-won wisdom that only such experiences can impart. I had begun to reclaim space in my life that had been stifled by the fear of judgment or ridicule. Social interactions felt lighter, freer, no longer constrained by the weight of unspoken betrayals.
I reconnected with friends I had unintentionally distanced myself from, sharing moments that had once been overshadowed by grief and caution. Daniel remained a steadfast presence, his quiet support a constant reminder that family isn't only those bound by blood. It's also those who stand by your side unconditionally. Together, we began planning small adventures, trips, and routines that had seemed impossible during the months of turmoil. The act of reclaiming my life, day by day, was both healing and exhilarating, a demonstration of how perseverance can transform pain into personal growth. Even the family, while not perfectly reconciled, had shifted into a new rhythm. Maya remained distant, her defenses intact, yet the power dynamics had shifted. The manipulation and ridicule that once dominated interactions were no longer tolerated. My mother had softened, acknowledging past mistakes with a humility that had been absent before, and Eleanor engaged more openly, cautiously but sincerely, signaling the possibility of rebuilding trust over time. The equilibrium established after the confrontation had solidified into a framework for future interactions, a delicate balance between honesty, accountability, and the understanding that past grievances could not be erased, but could be integrated into a new way of relating. In this transformed life, I found myself seeking ways to extend the lessons I had learned to others. The experience had revealed the profound effects of silence, complicity, and betrayal, and I felt compelled to use my story as a guide for anyone facing similar struggles. Through writing, sharing, and quietly mentoring friends and acquaintances navigating grief or family betrayal, I discovered a sense of purpose that extended beyond my personal experience. My story, once private and painful, became a bridge for empathy, understanding, and empowerment. Each conversation reminded me that speaking truth, even when difficult and isolating, can ignite change, foster awareness, and help others find their own voice. The miscarriage, while still a source of grief, had become a touchstone for resilience. I had learned to embrace vulnerability as a strength, understanding that acknowledging pain does not make one weak, but rather human and capable of profound courage. Daniel and I had begun exploring ways to support others dealing with loss, grief, and betrayal, translating personal experience into acts of compassion and advocacy. This work gave my pain meaning, transforming what had been a source of silent suffering into a vehicle for hope and empowerment. I realized that the darkest moments of life, when met with courage and authenticity, can become catalysts for profound growth and change, shaping not only personal identity, but also the impact one has on others. Symbolically, I found solace in small rituals that represented my transformation. Each morning, I lit a candle in the corner of my apartment, a quiet acknowledgement of my resilience, my grief, and the journey I had undertaken. The candle became a reminder that light could emerge from darkness, that hope could persist even amid betrayal, and that the act of claiming one's voice could illuminate paths for oneself and for others. I also kept a journal, chronicling daily victories, moments of clarity, and reflections on the ways my courage had reshaped relationships and personal boundaries. These tangible markers of change grounded me, reinforcing the sense that I had not merely survived, but had emerged transformed, stronger, and more capable of navigating life on my own terms.
Looking back, the journey from the first text I sent, the desperate plea in the family chat, to this point was almost unrecognizable in terms of personal growth. That initial message, a cry for support, had triggered a cascade of events, both painful and transformative. The exposure of betrayal, the confrontation with the antagonist, the backlash, the emotional lows, and the eventual recognition of truth had all been integral steps in the process. Each experience had forced me to confront uncomfortable realities, challenge ingrained patterns, and insist on dignity and accountability.
The culmination of this journey was not just reconciliation or vindication, but the profound sense of personal empowerment and clarity that came from navigating the storm with integrity and resilience. By the time spring arrived, the transformation was fully tangible. I could walk into family gatherings without fear of ridicule or manipulation, equipped with boundaries, self-respect, and the quiet confidence of someone who had faced betrayal and emerged stronger. I had reclaimed my grief as a valid, unassailable part of my experience, and I had ensured that no one could weaponize it against me again. The truth had been spoken, the confrontation faced, and the consequences endured. And in that, I found not only closure, but purpose, a renewed life rooted in honesty, courage, and the capacity to help others navigate the shadows of betrayal with the same clarity and strength I had discovered. The final image of my transformation was simple but profound. Sitting in the sunlit corner of my apartment, Daniel beside me, the candle flickering quietly, I reflected on the journey from silence to voice, from isolation to empowerment. I had navigated grief, confronted betrayal, and claimed my truth. And now, the horizon was mine to define. The pain remained, but it was no longer a prison. It was a testament to endurance, a symbol of resilience, and a foundation for the life I was building, one grounded in authenticity, courage, and the enduring power of truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.